Hey there. I wanted to make a video today kind of looking into certain sacrificial acts that have been um, recorded in the Hebrew Bible. And I'm specifically going to look at the book of Joshua first, and then I'm going to kind of devolve from there. So with the book of Joshua, virtually everyone is familiar with this book because it's like basically the like classic Sunday school story and details the conquest of Jericho. So as everyone knows, the Israelites walk around the city 7 days, and on the eighth day they blow trumpets, and all of the city walls fall down, and they're helped by a character named Rahab. And so this is like a classic story, and so that's the one that you usually hear. But let's look more closely at what was actually happening, that usually the Sunday school kind of nonsense just totally glosses over. So once the walls of Jericho fall down, the Israelites commit something that is referred to as haram or ban. And those are Hebrew words, which is basically, it means extreme censure, to completely remove. So this is the slaughter in this situation. This is the slaughter of everything that breathes. From Joshua chapter 6, verse 17, and chapter 6, verse 21, the city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. And they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. This was considered a sacrificial act, and was committed as a devotional act and sacrifice to Yahweh. So it's so interesting here because this was explicitly sanctioned by Yahweh. John Collins, who's an amazing biblical scholar, notes that what is troubling in the biblical text is the claim that such action is justified by divine command and therefore praiseworthy. So you can find other tales of extreme violence in the Hebrew Bible, kind of moving away from that idea of haram, like the destruction of Jericho that I just mentioned, the zeal of Phinehas, Hagar, Tamar, Jael, the daughter of Jephthah, the murder and dismemberment of the unnamed woman, etc., etc. So you can see a bit here as I detail those, that there is a focus on violence against women that we can talk about in another video. So it's important to note too that haram was not unique to the experience of Jericho. There's evidence of a Moabite king slaughtering an entire Israelite city, devoting them to the destruction of the god Ashtar Chemosh. So again, the book of Joshua could have been a response to this event, like wishful thinking, right? You have to know here that the destruction of Jericho is a fictitious account. It did not happen. But it's disturbing nonetheless, as it sanctions violence against outsiders, specifically the Canaanites, who the Israelites historically hate and use as an example of evil. Some have gone so far as to interpret the destruction of Jericho as an allegory of piety and sin, so kind of an allegorical reading of that story. When reading the Bible, you have to realize that accounts like this are responses to events. They're wishful thinking. They're establishing dominance in the narrative. They're mythological, etc. The Israelites hated the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Babylonians, etc. The prophets were living in a time of extreme political upheaval with the Babylonian exile, and so a lot of their prophetic utterances are directly against the Babylonians and that experience. So Ezekiel's Valley of Dry Bones is a good example of a response to that, to their reality. Some of the Psalms of Lament, specifically where the psalmist takes great delight in dashing children's heads against the rocks, is another good example of just that that experience of hatred, of anger, of lamentation, of grief. You have to kind of take that into context when you're reading these tales. And if you're looking for kind of further context and understanding of the Israelites and their history, Tribes of Yahweh by Norman Gottwald is just, I mean, it's the best that you could read. It's a seminal text for understanding the Israelites. So thinking about this and this idea of anger and wishful thinking and destruction, there's another example of Phinehas mentioned above when he kills a fellow Israelite found laying in bed with a Moabite woman with a spear, literally thrusting both of them through at the same time. He's continually praised for his zeal and his faithfulness in the Bible. And so I don't want to get too deep into the politics of the Bible here with this. but rather just the methods of sacrifice that are seen throughout the Hebrew Bible. So the act of harem is a stunning example of this sacrificial act, seen in stories like Jericho, the stoning of Achan, and the blotting out of his entire lineage. So another interesting tidbit about the book of Joshua here is that it's full of all this imagery of piles of stones. So Jericho, Achan, setting up a pile of stones to commemorate, piles of stones as a burial marker, etc. And so it's something interesting to look into and analyze. And then also the harem of the Amalekites is another example. But I'd like to look at another kind of murky sacrificial act that occurs through the ancient Near East and is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. So to start this out, I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the story of Abraham being told to sacrifice his firstborn son, Isaac. What a bizarre story, like absolutely unimaginable, right? So we do know that child sacrifice was practiced in the ancient Near East and ancient Israel as well. So in Exodus chapter 13, verses 2, Yahweh exhorts, consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals is mine. 7 days it shall remain with its mother, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. What? So as we know, with Isaac, he is saved at the last minute, and Abraham is praised for his faithfulness and his desire to have fulfilled this basically demand to sacrifice his son. So on the flip side, in the book of Judges, the daughter of Jephthah, who I mentioned earlier, was not as lucky as Abraham's Isaac. She was the first to come out of the house. Jephthah promised he would sacrifice whatever first came out of his house. It was his daughter. And so in this case, God does not provide a substitute, and she is slain by her father as a sacrifice to Yahweh. So the philosopher Kierkegaard asserts here that ethical standards just do not apply to a divine command. Crazy, right? So as I've mentioned in past videos, the divine is just completely beyond our realm of understandings, our ethical standards, our morality, etc. And so I'll read a passage here from John Collins' book on the Hebrew Bible, which is fantastic. There was an installation called the Topheth in Gehenna outside Jerusalem, where children were burned as victims, hence the name Gehenna for hell in New Testament times. King Josiah destroyed the Topheth in a reform, allegedly so that no one would make a son or daughter pass through fire as an offering to Molech. From 2 Kings, Molech is usually taken to be a Canaanite god, but there's evidence that child sacrifice was also practiced in the name of Yahweh. And King Manasseh of Judah is also noted as participating in the cult of Molech and sacrificing his child. So Yahweh is also said to have commanded human sacrifice in Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 25 through 26, about the time of the Babylonian exile. So it's worth noting here that there was so much political tension and strife and just slaughtering happening throughout this time that it's hard to say whether this demand for sacrifice was a reaction to the horrible, violent reality that they were living in, or if there was some other culture or desire for sacrifice. It's very murky. Dylan Burns has a really good interview about Molech actually being a word for a type of sacrifice or sacrificial act. This has been an idea that's floated or been floating around since the 1930s. It's really interesting to look into if you can find his interview. It's really good. He's a great scholar. So we often see Moloch depicted as a bull with outstretched arms, with smoke and flames, and children being placed into his arms. But this depiction really became popular in the medieval period, harkening back to the Minotaur and other ancient accounts and sources. So we can't be sure there. So it's also worth noting throughout the Hebrew Bible, burnt offerings were seen as being pleasing to Yahweh, and also across various cultures, they were pleasing to deities in general. And it was a way for the sacrifice to pass through to the spiritual realm through smoke, hence the term passing through fire. The Hebrew term olah literally means that which ascends. The victim is seen as being given wholly to God. In other cultures of the ancient Near East, the gods are seen as being dependent on sacrifices to keep them strong, fed, pleased, etc., willing to defend cities in times of siege. Gods may choose to turn their backs on peoples if they do not provide for them well. In contrast, Yahweh is seen as not needing these gifts at all, but sacrifice is seen as a way to express gratitude or atone for sins. And so there's a lot of alignment of this idea with the laws regarding sacrifice in the book of Leviticus. Though, of course, human sacrifice is explicitly condemned in Leviticus chapters 18, verse 21, in which Yahweh says, "And thou shalt not give any of thy seed to set them apart to Molech." Obviously, you can see here there's some differing opinions on human sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible. I can tell you, though, that there are great details surrounding burnt offerings, waved offerings, grain offerings, etc. in Leviticus. It is literally an exhaustive account of acceptable sacrifices and how they should be performed. It's quite a slog to read through Leviticus, but it's really interesting. It's possible that the Israelites used animal sacrifice as a congruent method of worship to other pagan belief systems that proliferated during this time. So kind of as a way to syncretize, right? There was a study done at the University of Connecticut that looked at how animal sacrifice potentially powered Jerusalem's economy during this time, being the only place where an animal could be slaughtered by the Israelites was Jerusalem. It was the central temple. Millions of animals were likely sacrificed in Jerusalem each year, especially during festivals to atone for sin and to accommodate religious pilgrims. Flavius Josephus, who was an early historian who's really interesting and worth looking into, described priests as wading up to their knees in blood around the altar. Super cool. The business of ritual sacrifice powered the ancient economy, as animals were sacrificed for literally any sin or infraction committed by anyone. Similarly, there is an amazing ritual detailed in Leviticus of sacrificing one goat and driving another goat away into the wilderness for Azazel, who is not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, but is apparently a demon. It was common in other cultures to have these angry demons causing problems. They had to be appeased, but demons didn't appear in Jewish writings until the Hellenistic period. So I think I've mentioned this before, but really that idea of that Israelite afterlife was really just everyone went to, if anywhere at all, this shadowy pit called Sheol. And so whether you're righteous or not, everyone just went to the shadow pit. So anyways, the priest lays his hands on the goat, commits onto it all the sins of the people, and drives the goat away from the town into the wilderness. The sins of all the people are then therefore carried away with the goat for the demons in the woods. Sounds quite like a scapegoat, right? So anyways, that's just a brief look at sacrificial acts in the Hebrew Bible. But if you're interested in learning more about this, as I am, I'd suggest Walter Brueggemann, who's a prominent Old Testament scholar. Abraham Heschel wrote a really interesting book about the prophets. It's very poetic and philosophical. Really, anyone could enjoy that book and appreciate it. And Phyllis Treibel wrote an amazing book called Texts of Terror that specifically looks at a couple of accounts of violence against women in the Hebrew Bible and offers really a womanist interpretation of it. It's very interesting. And then Wilda Gaffney wrote the book called Womanist Midrash, which looks at and reintroduces women of the Hebrew Bible. And also, like I mentioned earlier, Tribes of Yahweh is a seminal book for understanding the Israelites. And then John Collins, who I've cited in this video, also has an amazing introduction to the Hebrew Bible that provides so much just like context and history to the creation of the scripture. So all those authors are worth looking into. They're great. All right, that's it for me today. Thanks so much.